conclusion of Shay's rebellion was that the states were not strong enough on their own to manage in the Articles of Confederation. Massachusetts was terrified by Shay's rebellion. Other states had similar unrest among their farmers. The United States was unable to pay off their international debts. The end result of Shay's rebellion was the scrapping of the Articles of Confederation and writing the United States Constitution. After Shay's rebellion, they wrote a new constitution that established a new government along very strongly federalist lines. They were terrified of Shay's rebellion. They were terrified of the idea that ordinary farmers could band together and overthrow the elite of the nation. And so, since those elite had control of the government, they wrote a document that put themselves in power and worked to keep them in power. So when you look at the United States government today, you see a fundamentally federalist document that has a very strong executive, that has a very small legislative body. Now, you might say 435 people, that's not very small. In terms of how many people each of those representatives represent, it's a pretty small legislative body. The Senate is even smaller. There are only 100 voting senators. That's a very small group of people that make decisions for a country of more than 300 million people. And that was formed largely because of the fear of rebellions like Shay's rebellion. Almost immediately after the Constitution was passed, there began to be a strong national economic plan. Alexander Hamilton, who you may have all heard of from that really wonderful musical that is sort of historical, Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. He was brilliant in terms of economics. He was also one of the first real United States nationalists. He believed in the success of the United States as a whole, not each state individually. And he took the idea of a national debt and used that national debt as a lever to get more power to the central government. If you had a national debt, then you were able to tax people in order to pay off the debt, and using the lever of taxes, you were able to get various states and people to do the things that you wanted. One of the very important elements of this new national economic plan was the Whiskey Act of 1791. The Whiskey Act of 1791 was exactly what it says. It was a tax on whiskey, a tax when it was sold from the producer to the merchants. And it was intended just to raise revenue for the central government. The idea was basically everybody drinks whiskey. There's a constant supply of whiskey. If we tax it, it's going to be a really easy way to scoop some money into the treasury. The problem with a whiskey tax, and maybe the benefit to a whiskey tax, was it disproportionately hurt Western farmers. So let me explain this just a little bit. American whiskey was made from wheat, and a farmer in Western New York or Western Pennsylvania who had a giant crop of wheat was handicapped by the lack of a transportation system. So you could have a fantastic crop of wheat, but there was literally no way to get that wheat to the people who wanted to buy it. There was no railway, certainly there was no Erie Canal, there's no roads to get from Western Pennsylvania into the cities where people would buy the wheat. So in the West, wheat farmers took the bulk of their grain crops, they distilled it into whiskey, and then instead of having 2 tons of wheat, they had 2 barrels of whiskey, and it was way easier to be able to transport those 2 barrels in an ox cart than it was to try and transport those 2 tons of wheat. So Eastern farmers are selling their wheat and they're perfectly happy and they are not taxed. Western farmers are converting their wheat into whiskey and very unhappy because they're getting taxed on the whiskey that they are trying to sell. Similar to the farmers in Shay's rebellion, the Western farmers resisted paying the whiskey tax. They beat up tax collectors. They organized into militia. They basically revived all of the Revolutionary era resistance strategies. They put up liberty poles. They wore liberty caps. They wrote tracts. They tarred and feathered tax collectors. Now, the Western farmers, both in Daniel Shay's time and during the Whiskey Rebellion, were absolutely politically opposed to Federalist ideas. They believed the government should be supporting the public welfare. If they saw hungry people, if they saw people who couldn't get to market, they should be building roads, they should be feeding people. They really thought that taxes should be laid equitably. They thought that a wheat farmer in Western Pennsylvania and a wheat farmer in Eastern Pennsylvania should be paying the same amount of tax on their crop, regardless of whether it was sold as wheat or sold as whiskey. They really felt that the government should be responding to the needs of the people, not the wealthy class. So they saw this whiskey tax as enriching the bankers, enriching the government, and they didn't see any payback that was going to be helping them. They felt like their crop was going to line Alexander Hamilton's pocket, and they were not happy about that. Unlike Shay's rebellion, where the United States could not act in response, the United States government acted strongly and directly to the Whiskey Rebellion. In August of 1794, the entirety of Western Pennsylvania was declared to be in a state of rebellion. A group of state militia were called together and federalized, meaning that they were put under federal control. And George Washington himself rode in front of these troops and gave them a good speech. He did not ride out with them in the end, but he rallied the troops, and it's the only time that an American president has led troops against American people. It seems like I shouldn't even have to say that, right? A president should not be leading troops against his own people. And this was a massively comedically oversized response to the rebellion in the West. So as soon as these United States soldiers began marching toward Western Pennsylvania to put down the rebellion itself collapsed. They were in no position to be able to fight against the United States Army. The result of the Whiskey Rebellion was it proved the strength of the Federalist structure for the United States government. The leadership of the United States looked around and said, wow, we were scared of Daniel Shay, but we weren't really scared of the Whiskey Rebellion. We had all the structures we needed to come together and put down that rebellion. So it really solidified this idea that the Constitution, this federal structure, was the best way going forward for the United States. At the same time, it contributed to the Federalist Party's loss of the presidency. So in 1800, John Adams, the Federalist president, is going to be defeated, and the Federalists will never hold the presidency again because there was such popular outcry against marching federal troops against farmers that the party in charge, the Federalist Party, completely lost the support of the electorate. So kind of an irony there. Establish a federal structure for the government, but destroy the Federalist political party. So, as I said earlier in the lecture, I feel like the contrast between Federalist and broader thinking about the government is really reflecting questions that we still have about our government today. It's really interesting to look at these two rebellions and see how they were a battle for power, between the people at the bottom of the economic ladder and the people at the top of the economic ladder, and also how the fact of the rebellions themselves helped to lock into place the form of government that we practice still today.